The third characteristic of light that I want to go into in more depth is, of course, quantity. How much light is there in a scene? Now, this can be a very easy one to take for granted because both our eyes and most cameras adjust to the amount of light automatically. However, the amount of light you've got to play with will have a big effect on the creative choices in your shots.
Quantity of light is also very, very important, of course. One of the catches is that we often take quantity of light, how much light there is falling on our subjects, for granted. And the reason for this is that our eyes adjust very, very rapidly to changes in quantity of light. You often only notice the difference when you step inside from a bright daylight into a darkened room or vice versa. The rest of the time, our eyes do a very, very good job of adapting, so we don't notice that there's not much light around or lots of light around. By the same token, a camera that's set to automatic exposure modes of some sort will adjust as well. Now, if you're on manual exposure mode, which hopefully you are, you'll need to adjust, otherwise you'll get the wrong exposure. But either way, the amount or quantity of light will affect your exposure options in terms of the shutter speed, aperture and ISO you have to choose, and that of course will affect the creative choices within the photograph. So let's look at two examples. Here we have a portrait taken outside on a bright summer's day, as you can see. And here we have another portrait taken at night under streetlights with a little bit of flash to lift our fella there. Now, let's look at what light they were shot under. Going back to our first one, exposure was 1/250th of a second at f5.6 at ISO 100. The nighttime image was shot 1/60th of a second at f4 at ISO 800. Now, on the surface, that's just fine. Just adjust the exposure to fit. But look at the overall difference. Our first one, again to recap, 1/250th, f5.6, ISO 100. Our nighttime one, 1/60th of a second, f4 at ISO 800. Now, of course, they both look fine. The difference, 2 stops in the shutter speed, 1 stop in the aperture, 3 stops in the sensitivity in the ISO. So what that adds up to in total is 6 whole stops difference between this one taken outside in bright daylight and this one taken at night on the street. Now, of course, because there's so much less light in this second image, that is going to limit our choices. It's given us a slower shutter speed, which will obviously be less effective at freezing movement. We've opened up the aperture by a stop, which gives us less depth of field, and we've increased the ISO, which of course increases the amount of noise that will be in the image if we were to zoom in close and look at this in detail. Now, all of those choices were made so as I could still render the image correctly and get an exposure I wanted that allowed a little bit of the background light to show up whilst also lighting our guy with a bit of flash, but I've still had to make those choices based on how much quantity there was. And before you get too carried away thinking, oh, it's always about when there isn't enough light, sometimes you might want to reduce the amount of light. Sometimes you might want there to be less light around so that you could use a slower shutter speed, for example, or you wanted a wider aperture to get less depth of field. Whichever way you cut it, the amount of light you've got to play with is going to affect your choice of these 3 exposure factors, and therefore how the final image will look. So although it's very easy to take it for granted with the naked eye and in automatic mode, if you're trying to create a specific effect, you may need to have a good think about how much light you've got to play with.
So the essentials of quantity are, is there enough light to create the image we want to create? Now, having too much light is a fairly easy situation to deal with. Let's say, hypothetically, you want to create that lovely, beautiful flowing water effect where the water gets all ghostly, so for that you need a nice slow shutter speed. But you've stopped the aperture down as far as it will go, and you're at the lowest sensitivity on the ISO on the camera, so you can't get any slower than, say, 1/30th of a second. That's quite frustrating because you won't get that effect you're after. Now, obviously, you're on a tripod, of course, to minimise camera shake, but one simple thing you can do is add what's called a neutral density filter. I have not actually a neutral density filter, but in fact a polarizing filter here, although they serve the same purpose. This functions effectively like a pair of sunglasses, and all it does is cut out the amount of light that is falling on the lens, through the lens and onto the camera. They come in different strengths, so you can cut out a stop, 2 stops, 3, sometimes even 6 stops, I believe. The only thing I'll bear in mind is make sure you buy decent quality ones, because of course this is going on the front of the lens, so it will affect the final image quality. If you buy a cheap, nasty one, that will degrade your otherwise expensive lens. But of course all they do is prevent light getting through to the sensor at the back of the camera, so you can use a slower shutter speed, or should you need to for aesthetic purposes, you can use them to allow you to get a much wider aperture. As I say, this is actually a polarizer, because I don't use ND filters all that very much, and this functions the same, except I've only got the one amount of neutral density with it, because this isn't a variable one. But yeah, serves the same purpose for the most part. Now, if you've not got enough light, this is where things can get complicated and expensive. I'm not going to go into enormous specifics about these various different types of light you see in front of me. That's going to come later in the course. All I'm going to talk about is the relative quantity aspects, the aspects of these where one light source might be more appropriate than a different light source. The quantity or power of the light you choose needs to, of course, match the conditions of what you're shooting, particularly when you're mixing different light types and light sources. Let's say you're trying to balance the very strong light cast by the midday sun. You've got somebody there and there's the bright sunshine down on them, and they've got a very, very dark shaded face, and you want to lift that shadow by putting some light on it. Well, in terms of quantity, the flash in something like that is probably not going to have very much effect against the all-powerful midday sun. You're going to need probably a flash gun more like that sort of size to give you the right amount of quantity and power, or possibly even something like that, okay, because the relative quantity coming out from these devices versus the quantity coming out from the sun has got to match better. Obviously this doesn't put out much power, this puts out quite a bit of power, this puts out a lot of power, okay, in relation to what the sun is doing. This even matters in more simplistic indoor scenes. Let's say you're shooting indoors and you're trying to maintain the mood that you've got in the room you're shooting in, but that's not giving you the right exposure combination that you want. You can bring in lights like this great big thing here, this 1 kilowatt tungsten light. The problem is 1 kilowatt is something like 16 times more powerful than the average household bulb at 60 watts. So using these, yes, that will give you perhaps the shutter speed and aperture combination you want, but it might totally overpower the lights in the room you're shooting in and thereby totally kill the mood. Just to demonstrate, let's see what happens if I turn this on. Bearing in mind what you've got over there is a little energy saver bulb. As I turn this on, the auto exposure in this camera is going to go all over the place. Okay, that is obviously putting out an awful lot more light than the light off to my left. And if I spill it over there and fill it in, the light from that little table lamp is basically, it's disappeared now. We've lost all the mood in the room, because the relative power of this compared to that is of course much, much higher. Of course, most decent lights will allow you to adjust their power output, and it's usually a function of how expensive and how well made a light is as to how much range of power output you get. Something that only lets you turn the power down by half or not turn the power down at all isn't much use. But something with a big range of power output will allow you to perhaps bring its range within the boundaries and the quantity of other lights you're using. For example, this rather fantastic and very expensive Profoto B1 head, 10 is full power output, and it goes all the way down to 2. Each one of these is 1 stop difference, and it also allows me, of course, to do it in tenths of a stop increments. So that's 8 stops of power output in this. So at full power, this could easily do the job of, say, balancing the midday sun, but turn the power way down, and it'll be more in the range of what a little flash gun like this might put out. So I wouldn't lose the mood if I was, say, using some of these as well. So having a big range of power output on a light of any sort is extremely useful, and also allowing it to be finely tuned. As I say, in this case, this will tune tenths of a stop, is also very handy, because of course I can bring the relative powers of my lights very, very close together to create exactly the look that I want. Now, if you think back to how those 4 facets of light work, distance can also be used, of course, as a primitive quantity control by simply moving a light closer into the subject or further away. Obviously, the closer something is, the more of it will hit the subject, and therefore its power, if you like, will go up. And by comparison, if you take it further away, less of the light will hit the subject, and you'll turn its power down. Now, the same thing will happen if you alter the quality of a light. Because, of course, if you're making the light source larger, either by, say, bouncing it off something like a silver umbrella or a white wall, or by diffusing it, so firing a light through a piece of translucent material of some sort, the front of a softbox, or a big diffusion panel you hold up to shade somebody against the direct sun, you're scattering the light more, you're diffusing the light more, and less of it will get to the subject. It'll be scattered and it won't take a nice, strong, direct route. If I take this flash gun, which is to start with quite a hard, quite powerful light, and I point it right at the camera there, that's about 4 feet difference, and it will produce quite a hard light, because it's quite a small light source. If, by comparison, I want to make this softer, the quickest way I could do that would be to point it up into the ceiling, like that, bounce off the ceiling, and therefore it'll come off the ceiling, it'll spread out much wider and be much, much softer. But now, the light isn't travelling just from the flash gun to the camera, which is 4 or 5 feet. It's got to go up to the ceiling, which is a good 6 feet, and back down to the subject, which is another 6 feet. So it's now doing about 12 feet rather than, say, 4 or 5 feet. So obviously, the quantity of it is going to have to increase if I want to maintain the same exposure once I've diffused it and once I've bounced it off things. And it could just as easily be the silver of inside of a brolly, or the inside of a softbox, or anything of the sort. Now, of course, that matters because think back to our earlier example where we had somebody outside in bright sunlight, and you say to yourself, oh, I need something as powerful as this to match and work against the sun, because the sun is very powerful, but I want to diffuse this and make it soft. If you diffuse it in some way, whether you bounced off a brolly, you put it through a softbox, whatever it might be, you will reduce the quantity. Okay, you will be lowering the amount of output from this, and therefore you might not have enough quantity all of a sudden. So all of these things tie together. Okay, all these 4 facets, as we know, are interrelated. Okay, hope that was illuminating, pun fully intended. If you've got any questions or anything, just stick them in the comments below. Like if you like what you're seeing, and subscribe if you want regular notifications. And I'll see you next week when we talk about the colour of light.